Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Unidentified drones are crossing NATO borders, while explosions at European ammunition facilities are raising uncomfortable questions about sabotage, attribution, and Russia's expanding gray zone campaign. Joining us today on TVP World to assess whether Europe is confronting a widening hybrid threat is Denys Kolesnyk, president of the MENA Research Center. His expertise covers strategic intelligence, Russia, Ukraine, Central and Eastern Europe, and information and influence operations. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So recently we saw NATO shooting down an unidentified drone over Latvia. Now this is perhaps a little bit different from previous instances where NATO just kind of watches it closely. Now what does this decision mean, and is the security environment in the eastern flank changing?
Well, I guess first of all, when the drone has been shut down by the NATO aircraft stationed in the region, it means that this aircraft potentially could have been harmful for the residents or for the critical infrastructure. So I guess they had the reason to shut it down, because what we've been observing previously to this event is that there was always some kind of a restraint, which means we will just try to ignore, if you want to put it plainly, this kind of Russian drones, but this time it was something different. Also, we can, for example, think that maybe it's about sending some kind of a signal to the Russians as well, showing that, for example, we can be more serious about downing this kind of aerial machines. So, for example, maybe next time it could be a Russian jet, because we know that Russian aircraft have been violating the, for example, Estonian airspace, especially last year, quite a lot. The MiG-31, I mean.
Right. So how do you read these repeated drone incursions into NATO territory? Would you say it is mostly spillover from the Ukrainian war, or could it be some sort of deliberate attempts to probe NATO's radar coverage, reaction time, rules of engagement, etc.?
First of all, we have to distinguish what are those drones. On one hand, we have quite a few drones coming from Ukraine, because they simply for example, fall into the NATO territory due to the Russian electronic warfare activities. And also there are sometimes the Russian drones. But again, it's sometimes difficult to carry out the attribution if we don't have the debris, or, for example, if the drone just there was an incursion, but then it went go towards the Russian territory, for example. So we have to distinguish this. With regard to the Russian drones and even Ukrainian drones going to Russia, but through the due to the EV, electronic warfare, incursion into the NATO territory, Russians observe how we react. So for Russians, it is important to understand how we would potentially react in this or in that event. So you're right in both ways. Russians are observing whether those drones are Ukrainian or Russian.
Right. Now, do you think that possible deniability itself can be one of Russia's most effective weapons, seeing that creating incidents serious enough to kind of disrupt Europe, but also kind of being ambiguous enough to prevent any sort of decisive response?
Well, first of all, we have to note that in NATO, and we remember the 2016 NATO summit, NATO Warsaw summit, so the hybrid threats can be considered an armed attack against NATO, but at the same time, the formulation is so vague, and it is not an automatic procedure. So this means that the Russians can go and scale up and see what is the line we could tolerate. And I guess in their interest, it is to carry out their activities and hybrid activities, sabotage, etc., under the threshold of war. So in order to avoid triggering the Article 5. And that's what they've been doing quite a lot of time. And by the way, Ukraine was, even though not a NATO member state, but it was prior to 2022 full-scale invasion, it was a laboratory somehow of the Russian hybrid activities. And a lot of lessons, I guess, are to learn from there.
Right. Can you help us understand the incentive here? Because a lot of talks is centered around how Russia is trying to perhaps probe NATO and some sort of provocation as well, seeing that they're already stuck in an engagement with Ukraine and not really doing that hot in the front lines. What's the incentive right now to try to open potentially another front and get into some kind of provocative confrontation with NATO?
I guess it allows the Russians, as we were discussing before, to test the NATO capabilities, real capabilities like radars and time of response every time when there is an incursion. Also, the reaction from NATO as a whole and the reaction of this or that NATO country. And also it gives Russia the possibility to send somehow a message that, well, guys, we can do stuff on your territory and you can do nothing about it. And I guess this message is not only to send to the local Russian population in Russia, but mostly to send to the world. That see, NATO is not so serious organization, and we, Russia, we are an important power, and we can challenge this kind of huge alliances alone. So I guess it's about messaging at this time, at least.
All right, speaking of messaging, now both sides, be it Russia, be it Ukraine, are both pointing fingers at each other, calling potential false flag attacks. Now, how realistic is the threat of such operation using, be it drones to appear Ukrainian, particularly against critical infrastructure in Poland or even like any other Baltic states?
Well, you'll remember, I guess, the 2017 Ukrainian arms depot sabotage in Kharkiv region, when the investigation concluded that it was a Russian drone that carried out Russian thermite grenade explosives that set up the fire in this arms depot and caused huge cost to the Ukrainian armed forces. It was in 2017. And recently we've seen some kind of explosions in Bulgaria. There were, prior to this as well, explosions on arms plants or arms depot in Bulgaria and Czech Republic. So I guess it's something that Russians can do. And we also have to point out that since 2022, the Russians rely much less on their own operatives in NATO, because there were a lot of expulsions since 2022. The counterintelligence services ramped up their capabilities against the Russian potential operations. So Russians today recruit people via Telegram, via other social media, pay them, and actually oftentimes those may be citizens of those countries carrying out this kind of attacks, or foreigners living in those countries, but not Russian operatives per se. This is quite a difference since 2022 we've been observing.
Right, like you mentioned, now Russians are using foreign recruits as well to carry out a lot of the operations, making attribution even more difficult. We also saw recent explosions at ammunition facilities, be it in Italy and Bulgaria. That's still under investigation as well. Now, how can governments remain alert to sabotage, but also not be overzealous in attributing every industrial accident to Moscow, perhaps?
Well, definitely. Even though we may be having the easiness to attribute these kind of things to Russia, but sort of investigations should be done, and it also plays in hand to the Russian plausible deniability, because they know if something happens, and even if they were behind it, so it would take days, weeks, or even months for the investigation to have some conclusions, and not necessarily pointing towards Russia, or those conclusions may be not full enough to attribute this or that attack. So what the governments can do, they definitely have to increase security over this kind of facilities, but at the same time we should not be considering every foreigner living in our countries as a threat, because potential threat can be every person, basically. So it's about the securing those kind of objects, the arms depots, the military industry facilities, but at the same time we cannot do much more, I guess, what we are doing right now.
So at what point do you think a repeated gray zone attack or these kind of hybrid operation becomes serious enough for NATO to consider some sort of collective response? Or is the ambiguity precisely what makes Article 5 so difficult to apply?
Well, first of all, it's political, and we understand that the triggering the Article 5 at this point, and I guess in Moscow they understand it as well, it is not possible. Even though the Russians would, I don't know, explode a factory, and we would attribute this, but it most likely will not trigger the Article 5 because nobody wants to get at war with Russia. And I guess the problem is all those attributions because it's partly political. And if you're lacking the political courage to undertake this or that decision, so we will not be necessarily attributing things to Russia, or we'll be trying to downplay it. For example, as we've seen a few years ago, we were also downplaying the drone incidents in the northern Europe, in Germany. We've been downplaying the Russians' constant violations of our airspace. But you also remember that in 2015 or 16, when Russians have violated the Turkish airspace, Turks have shut down that Russian aircraft and the violations stopped. So I guess at some point it would be necessary for us to take these kind of measures, but what is its threshold is definitely not to us and even not to the military to decide, but it's rather a political issue, unfortunately.
All right, like you mentioned, the threshold is very hard to determine. So the question leads us to whether or not Europe is effectively stuck in a conflict that's below the threshold of conventional war, but also fought through things like proxy, sabotage, cyber attacks, electronic warfare.
Yes, indeed, we are somehow stuck, and that is why it is in our best interest to help the Ukrainians to carry out the actual war. And on our side, we have to be sending the Russians more serious signals. But at the same time, indeed, nobody wants to fire up another war somewhere in the Baltics, for example. So that's the cautious approach from the politicians. And I guess, yes, indeed, we are somehow, for some years, we are still stuck in this kind of under the threshold of war operations.
Right, so it also emphasizes how important it is to continue to support Ukraine so that we can still put the threat to Russia without having to engage in these very difficult maneuvers as well. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. For more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.